"She's too tired to even cry anymore, Daddy." The words that shattered a father's heart into a million pieces. "Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from or what time it is where you are. Enjoy this story that might change how you see the world." The bitter December wind cut through downtown Chicago like a knife, carrying with it the scent of snow and exhaust fumes from the endless stream of traffic that never seemed to sleep. Thomas Martinez sat hunched on the concrete steps of Morrison's grocery, his broad shoulders curved inward, as if trying to shield himself from more than just the cold. His weathered hands, once steady enough to perform delicate electrical work on million-dollar machines, now trembled as they adjusted the thin blanket around his 7-year-old daughter, Emily. Her small body was curled against his chest, so light he could barely feel her weight, yet heavy with the burden of everything he'd failed to protect her from. Emily's blonde hair, once bouncing with curls that reminded him so much of her mother, now hung limp and dull around her pale face. Her pink winter coat, the last good thing they owned, was 3 sizes too big, a donation from someone who'd probably never imagined the child who would wear it. Thomas pressed his chapped lips to the top of Emily's head, breathing in the scent that was still somehow purely hers beneath the accumulated grime of their circumstances. She hadn't complained once today. Not when they'd been turned away from the shelter because it was full, not when the soup kitchen had run out of food before they reached the front of the line. Not even when the security guard at the mall had escorted them out with harsh words about loitering and setting a bad example for paying customers. "Daddy," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible above the rumble of passing cars. "It's okay if I don't eat tonight. I'm not really hungry anyway." The lie hit Thomas harder than any physical blow he'd ever received. He knew she was starving. They both were. Her last real meal had been yesterday morning at the Methodist Church downtown, where volunteers served breakfast to anyone who showed up before 8 a.m. But Emily, his brave little girl, was trying to make him feel better. At 7 years old, she was already learning to carry burdens that should never belong to a child. Thomas closed his eyes, fighting back the tears that seemed to live permanently just behind his eyelids these days. 18 months ago, he'd been a different man entirely. He'd worn pressed shirts to his job as an electrical supervisor at Midwest Manufacturing, where he'd worked for 12 years. He'd owned a modest 3-bedroom house in Cicero with a small backyard where Emily played on the swing set he'd built with his own hands. His wife Sarah had tended to a garden that produced tomatoes and herbs that made their small kitchen smell like home. Cancer had taken Sarah in just 4 months. 4 months from diagnosis to the funeral that had cost more than Thomas had ever imagined possible. The medical bills that followed were astronomical. Treatments that insurance only partially covered, experimental medications that offered hope at thousands of dollars per dose, specialists who required payment up front. Thomas had mortgaged and remortgaged their home, cashed out his retirement fund, sold his truck, and borrowed against his credit cards until there was nothing left to leverage. When the company downsized and eliminated his position 6 months after Sarah's death, Thomas had already been drowning. The unemployment benefits barely covered a quarter of their monthly expenses. The house went into foreclosure within 3 months. He'd fought it, hired a lawyer with money he didn't have, filled out endless paperwork pleading for mortgage modifications and payment deferrals, but the bank's patience had limits, and Thomas had exceeded them all. The day they'd been evicted, Thomas had loaded what they could carry into his aging Honda Civic and driven to his brother's apartment in Milwaukee. But Miguel's lease prohibited additional tenants, and his girlfriend made it clear that a grieving man and his traumatized daughter were not welcome complications in their lives. After 2 uncomfortable weeks sleeping on an air mattress in Miguel's living room, Thomas had packed their belongings again and returned to Chicago, hoping the city's larger size might offer more opportunities and resources. That had been 8 months ago. 8 months of shelters when they could get in, of sleeping in the car when they couldn't, of slowly selling their remaining possessions to buy food and gas. The Honda had died 3 weeks ago, stranding them without transportation or shelter. Now they carried everything they owned in 2 backpacks and a rolling suitcase with a broken wheel that made a rhythmic clicking sound as they walked from place to place, searching for somewhere safe to rest. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that he was homeless in the city where he'd been born, where he'd met Sarah at a community college dance 22 years ago, where Emily had taken her first steps in the living room of their little house. Chicago had once felt like home. Now it felt like a maze designed to remind him daily of everything he'd lost and everything he couldn't provide for his daughter. Emily shifted in his arms, and Thomas felt the sharp angles of her shoulder blades through the thin fabric of her sweater. She'd lost so much weight that her clothes hung loose on her small frame, making her look even younger and more fragile than her 7 years. Her teacher from before, when she'd attended Lincoln Elementary and worried about spelling tests and playground politics, wouldn't recognize the quiet, careful child she'd become. "Daddy," Emily said, lifting her head to look at him with Sarah's green eyes. "Remember when Mommy used to make those cookies? The ones shaped like stars?" Thomas's throat tightened. "Sugar cookies. She made them every Christmas. Do you think she can see us now? From heaven?" The question hung in the cold air between them, and Thomas struggled to find an answer that wouldn't shatter what remained of his daughter's faith in the world. How could he tell her that some nights, when Emily finally fell asleep in his arms, he looked up at the empty sky and wondered if anyone was watching at all? How could he explain that the God who had supposedly loved Sarah enough to call her home had left her husband and daughter to freeze on the streets? "I think she sees us," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "And I think she wants us to keep trying, keep believing that things will get better." Emily nodded solemnly, accepting his words with the trust that children reserve for their parents, even when those parents feel utterly undeserving of such faith. She settled back against his chest, and Thomas resumed his careful surveillance of the street, watching for police officers who might move them along, for predators who might see a vulnerable man and child as easy targets, for any opportunity that might present itself. The grocery store behind them had closed at 9 p.m., its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows through the windows onto displays of fresh produce and packaged goods that might as well have been on another planet for all Thomas's ability to access them. He'd applied for food stamps weeks ago, but the bureaucratic process moved slowly, and their caseworker seemed to view their situation as just another file in an endless stack of human misery that required processing rather than urgent attention. Tomorrow, Thomas promised himself, he would try again. He would visit the employment office, fill out more applications, stand in more lines, make more phone calls to numbers that led to voicemail boxes that were perpetually full. He would smile and shake hands and pretend that his appearance, clothes that had been worn too many times without proper washing, shoes with holes that let in water and cold, the general aura of desperation that seemed to cling to people in his situation, wouldn't immediately mark him as unemployable in a job market that favored the already fortunate. But tonight, all that mattered was keeping Emily warm and safe until morning brought new possibilities for disappointment or hope. Thomas pulled the blanket more tightly around them both and settled in for another long night of watching the world sleep while he remained awake, standing guard against dangers both real and imagined, protecting the only thing he had left to lose. The clock on the bank across the street read 11:47 p.m. when Thomas noticed the woman approaching. Most people who walked past at this hour either pretended not to see them or crossed to the other side of the street, their discomfort with human suffering manifesting in elaborate efforts to avoid eye contact. Thomas had learned to recognize the subtle body language of avoidance, the quickened pace, the sudden interest in cell phone screens, the way people's shoulders tensed as they passed, as if poverty might be contagious. But this woman walked directly toward them, her steps neither hurried nor hesitant. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and flour dusting the front of her dark blue apron. Her jeans were faded and practical, her sneakers worn but clean. Everything about her suggested someone who worked with her hands, who understood the value of honest labor and the dignity that came with earning your own way in the world. Diane Patterson had been closing her small bakery, Sweet Dreams, just 3 blocks away, when she decided to take the longer route to her car. She'd been feeling restless, unsettled by the notice from her landlord that had arrived that morning. Another rent increase that would push her monthly expenses beyond what her modest business could sustain. At 62, the prospect of starting over somewhere else felt overwhelming, but staying might mean financial ruin. She'd almost walked past without stopping. The sight of homeless individuals was unfortunately common in this part of downtown Chicago, and Diane had learned to balance compassion with practical safety concerns. But something about the careful way the man held the child, the protective curve of his body around her small form, had made her pause. "Are you two all right?" she asked softly, stopping a respectful distance away. Thomas looked up, startled by the genuine concern in her voice. Most people who spoke to them wanted something, for them to move along to justify their presence, to prove they weren't dangerous or crazy or trying to run some elaborate scam. This woman's question seemed to come from a place of simple human caring, without agenda or judgment. "We're just resting," Thomas replied automatically. The response he'd learned minimized conflict and encouraged people to keep walking. "We'll move along if we're causing problems." But Diane didn't move. She stood there studying them with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen genuine need before, who could distinguish between hustlers and people who'd simply run out of options. Emily's pale face and thin frame, Thomas's worn clothing and careful posture, the way they both seemed to shrink into themselves, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. These weren't details that could be faked or manufactured for sympathy. "How long have you been on the streets?" Diane asked, her voice gentle but direct. Thomas hesitated, unsure whether honesty would help or hurt their situation. "A few months," he said finally, which was true if you only counted their time without any shelter at all. He didn't mention the months before that, when they'd bounced between temporary arrangements and increasingly desperate accommodations. Diane nodded, recognizing the careful way he passed his words. People in crisis learn to edit their stories, to present only the details that might generate assistance rather than judgment. She'd done the same thing herself years ago, when her own life had fallen apart in ways that seemed impossible to explain to people who'd never experienced such complete systematic failure. "What's her name?" Diane asked, nodding toward Emily. "Emily," Thomas replied, his voice softening with pride and pain. "She's 7. Emily lifted her head at the sound of her name, offering Diane a shy smile that revealed the resilience children possessed even in the worst circumstances. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the traffic noise. Diane felt something crack open in her chest, not her heart breaking exactly, but something deeper. The recognition of innocence in impossible circumstances, of a child who should be home in a warm bed with a stuffed animal and nightlight, instead curled against her father on cold concrete, while strangers decided whether they were worthy of basic human consideration. "Hello, Emily," Diane said, crouching down to bring herself closer to the child's eye level. "I'm Diane. Are you warm enough?" Emily glanced at her father before answering, already learning the complex negotiations required for survival. "I'm okay," she said, though her small body was visibly shivering despite Thomas's efforts to keep her covered. Diane straightened, her mind racing through possibilities and limitations. She thought about her own small apartment, about neighborhood safety, about the wisdom of inviting strangers into her personal space. She thought about liability and police reports, and all the reasonable concerns that kept most people from acting on their impulses to help. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a single key attached to a piece of kitchen twine. The key was brass, worn smooth from years of use, and it opened the storage room behind her bakery where she kept extra supplies and equipment. "There's a room behind my bakery," Diane said, holding out the key. "It's clean and warm. There's a small cot that one of my employees used to use during break times. It's not much, but it's better than this." Thomas stared at the key as if it were a mirage, something too good to be real. "Why would you do that?" he asked, his voice thick with suspicion born from months of learning that apparent kindness often came with strings attached, conditions that weren't revealed until you'd already committed yourself to someone else's idea of charity. "You don't know us," Thomas continued. "We could be anyone. We could take your things, damage your property. Why would you trust us?" Diane was quiet for a long moment, considering how much of her own story to share with these strangers. How could she explain that 15 years ago, she'd been living in her car after her divorce, working 3 part-time jobs that still weren't enough to cover first month's rent and security deposits? How could she describe the night when a church volunteer had given her the key to a small office where she could sleep safely for a week while she got back on her feet? "Someone helped me once," Diane said simply, "when I had nothing and nowhere to go. I told God that if I ever got the chance, I'd pass that kindness forward." She held out the key again, and this time Thomas reached for it with trembling fingers. The metal was warm from being in Diane's pocket, and it felt heavier than its size suggested, weighted with possibility and hope that Thomas had almost forgotten how to recognize. "The address is 847 West Madison," Diane continued. "Go around to the alley behind the building. The door is marked storage. There are some crackers and bottled water in there and a small electric heater. Use whatever you need." Thomas closed his fist around the key, feeling tears threaten to overwhelm him. "Thank you," he whispered. "I promise we'll be gone by morning. We won't cause any trouble." Diane nodded, but something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced that one night would be sufficient to address whatever circumstances had brought them to this point. "Be safe," she said, stepping back toward the street. "Both of you." She walked away without looking back, understanding instinctively that gratitude could be overwhelming for people who'd grown unaccustomed to receiving it. Thomas watched her disappear around the corner, then looked down at the key in his palm as if it might vanish if he blinked. "Daddy?" Emily said, sensing the shift in his emotional state. "What's happening?" "Someone is being very kind to us," Thomas replied, helping Emily to her feet and gathering their few possessions. "We're going to sleep somewhere warm tonight." Emily's face lit up with the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her in days. "Really? Like a real bed?" "Like a real bed," Thomas confirmed, shouldering their backpacks and taking Emily's hand. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go find our home for tonight." As they walked through the quiet streets toward Madison Avenue, Thomas found himself praying for the first time in months, not for miracles or divine intervention, but simply for the chance to prove worthy of the trust that a stranger had placed in them. He thought about the woman named Diane, about what kind of life experiences had shaped her into someone who would give her key to homeless strangers on a cold December night. He didn't know that in a few hours, when Diane returned to check on them, she would find the storage room immaculate, the key left on the small table with a note that read, "You saved us tonight. We don't know your name, but we'll never forget your kindness. T&E." He didn't know that this single act of compassion would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just their immediate circumstances, but the entire trajectory of their lives. All Thomas knew was that for the first time in months, Emily would sleep in a warm, safe place, and that tomorrow might bring possibilities he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine. 3 weeks had passed since that night in Diane's storage room, and Thomas had replayed her kindness in his mind hundreds of times, each memory serving as both comfort and torture. The warmth of that single night had awakened something dangerous in him, hope. And hope, Thomas had learned, was the cruelest emotion for people in his situation, because it made the return to harsh reality feel like falling off a cliff rather than simply continuing along a difficult path. They'd return to the streets the next morning as promised, leaving the key and their note of gratitude behind. Thomas had spent days afterward walking past Sweet Dreams Bakery, wanting to thank Diane properly, but also afraid that his presence might make her regret her kindness. Through the windows he could see her working behind the counter, her flour-dusted apron and gentle manner, with customers confirming that her compassion toward him and Emily hadn't been an aberration, but rather an expression of who she truly was. Now, huddled in the doorway of an abandoned warehouse on the city's south side, Thomas watched Emily's small body shake with coughs that had been getting worse for days. The cold had settled deep into her chest, producing a wet, rattling sound that made his stomach clench with fear every time he heard it. She needed medical attention, but emergency rooms were hostile territories for homeless families, places where social workers asked questions about custody and living situations that could result in Emily being taken away from him for her own protection. The irony was devastating. He could lose his daughter not because he didn't love her or care for her, but because he couldn't provide for her in ways that society deemed adequate. The system designed to protect children could tear apart families where poverty was confused with neglect, where a father's inability to afford housing was interpreted as unfitness rather than economic misfortune. "Daddy," Emily whispered, her voice hoarse from coughing. "My chest hurts." Thomas pulled her closer, feeling the heat radiating from her small body that suggested fever. Her cheeks were flushed, her breathing shallow and labored. She needed medicine, a warm place to recover, proper nutrition to help her body fight whatever infection had taken hold, all things that required money he didn't have and resources he couldn't access. "I know, sweetheart," he murmured, stroking her hair with hands that felt inadequate to comfort the depth of her suffering. "Try to rest. Tomorrow we'll find somewhere to get you help." But Emily was past the point where rest could solve her problems. That night, she woke repeatedly, her small body racked with coughing fits that left her gasping for air. Thomas held her against his chest, feeling helpless as her temperature climbed, and her breathing became increasingly labored. By dawn, he knew they were facing a crisis that his love and protection couldn't resolve. The nearest hospital was St. Mary's, a Catholic institution that advertised its commitment to serving all patients regardless of their ability to pay. Thomas carried Emily through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, her limp weight in his arms triggering immediate attention from the triage nurse, a woman in her 40s whose expression shifted from professional assessment to genuine concern as she observed Emily's condition. "She's been coughing for days," Thomas explained as they were rushed into an examination room. "High fever, trouble breathing. I don't have insurance, but I'll figure out how to pay. She needs help." Dr. Jennifer Walsh examined Emily with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen too many children suffer from conditions that should have been treated much earlier. Emily's lungs showed signs of pneumonia, her dehydration was severe, and her overall condition suggested someone whose immune system had been compromised by malnutrition and exposure. "She needs to be admitted," Dr. Walsh told Thomas after completing her examination. "IV antibiotics, monitoring, proper rest in a controlled environment. This isn't something we can treat without patient care." Thomas felt relief and terror in equal measure. Relief that Emily would receive the medical attention she desperately needed, terror about what admission to the hospital might trigger in terms of social services involvement. "How long?" he asked. "At least a week, possibly longer, depending on how she responds to treatment," Dr. Walsh replied. "Are you her father?" "Yes," Thomas said, producing the worn copy of Emily's birth certificate that he carried with their other essential documents. "It's just the two of us. Her mother passed away." Dr. Walsh nodded, making notes on Emily's chart. "We'll need contact information, insurance details if you have them, and some medical history." Thomas provided what information he could, omitting the details about their housing situation in the hope that focusing on Emily's immediate medical needs might postpone more complicated questions about their living circumstances. But hospitals were required to assess the safety and stability of children's home environments, and it didn't take long for a social worker to arrive with a clipboard and the kind of carefully neutral expression that Thomas had learned to fear. Patricia Reeves introduced herself as a family services coordinator, a title that sounded supportive, but felt threatening to Thomas's exhausted mind. She was a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that made her dangerous in ways that overt hostility would not have been. Thomas knew he could defend against aggression, but kindness required a different kind of vigilance. "Mr. Martinez," Patricia said, settling into the uncomfortable chair beside Emily's hospital bed, "I need to ask you some questions about Emily's living situation. It's standard procedure for all pediatric admissions." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "We have a place," he said, the lie coming automatically. "It's temporary, but it's safe." Patricia consulted her notes. "The address you provided, 847 West Madison, that's listed as a commercial property." "A bakery?" Thomas realized his mistake too late. In his exhaustion and panic over Emily's condition, he'd automatically provided Diane's address, the last place they'd felt truly safe. "We're staying with a friend who works there," he said, improvising desperately. "It's complicated. I understand that housing situations can be fluid," Patricia said, her tone remaining carefully non-judgmental. "But I need to verify that Emily will have a safe, stable place to go when she's discharged. Would it be possible to speak with your friend?" The request felt like a trap, though Thomas knew Patricia was probably just trying to do her job responsibly. Involving Diane in their situation seemed like a violation of the trust she'd shown them, an unfair burden on someone who'd already given more than she'd ever been obligated to provide. "She's not available right now," Thomas said, "but I can get you the information you need." Patricia made more notes, her pen scratching against the paper, with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet hospital room. "Mr. Martinez, I want to be clear about something. My primary concern is Emily's welfare. If there are challenges with your current housing situation, there are resources available to help, but I need honest information to connect you with appropriate services." Thomas understood what she was really saying. "Tell me the truth about your homelessness so I can help you, or continue lying and risk having Emily removed from your custody when the truth inevitably comes out." It was the kind of impossible choice that poverty presented daily, between honesty that might trigger punitive responses and deception that might provide temporary protection, but ultimately made things worse. "We've been going through a difficult time," Thomas admitted carefully. "I lost my job, had some health expenses after my wife died. We're working on getting back on our feet." Patricia nodded with the understanding of someone who'd heard variations of this story countless times. "I appreciate your honesty. There's no shame in needing help. Let me get you some information about emergency housing programs, food assistance, job placement services. We want to make sure Emily has what she needs when she goes home." The word home hung in the air between them, and Thomas felt the cruel irony of discussing a place that existed only in theory. But Patricia's approach suggested she was genuinely interested in helping rather than punishing, and Thomas found himself cautiously grateful for her presence despite his initial fear. Over the following days, as Emily slowly recovered under the hospital's care, Thomas spent his time filling out forms, meeting with caseworkers, and navigating the complex bureaucracy designed to assist families in crisis. The process was exhausting and often humiliating, requiring him to document and explain every aspect of their circumstances to people who had the power to help or harm them based on their assessment of his worthiness as a parent. But Emily was getting better. The antibiotics were working, her fever had broken, and she was beginning to eat solid food again. The hospital staff treated them both with respect and dignity, never making Thomas feel like his poverty disqualified him from being a loving father, or Emily from receiving excellent medical care. On Emily's 5th day in the hospital, as Thomas sat beside her bed reading from a book one of the nurses had provided, she looked up at him with clear eyes and said, "Daddy, I feel better now." Thomas felt tears of relief threaten to overwhelm him. "I'm so glad, sweetheart. You scared me for a while there." "Are we going to have a house when I get out?" Emily asked, her 7-year-old directness cutting through all the carefully diplomatic language the adults had been using around their situation. Thomas considered lying, offering false reassurance that would protect her from anxiety about their uncertain future. But Emily had lived through too much to be easily deceived, and she deserved honesty even when the truth was difficult. "I don't know yet," Thomas said finally, "but I promise you that wherever we go we'll be together. That's what matters most." Emily nodded solemnly, accepting his words with the resilience that children develop when their world has been unpredictable for too long. "As long as we're together," she agreed, reaching for his hand with fingers that finally felt warm again. The discharge meeting took place in a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken promises. Thomas sat across from a panel of hospital administrators, social workers, and case managers who held Emily's future in their collective hands, each armed with clipboards and the kind of professional detachment that allowed them to discuss human suffering as if it were a logistical problem requiring efficient resolution. Patricia Reeves led the discussion with the diplomatic skill of someone who'd learned to deliver bad news in language that sounded helpful rather than devastating. "Mr. Martinez, we've contacted several emergency housing programs in the area. Unfortunately, most have waiting lists that extend several months. The few immediate options available are either unsafe for children or have restrictions that wouldn't accommodate your family situation." Thomas felt his stomach clench. He'd spent the week filling out applications, making phone calls and meeting with various social service representatives who'd expressed sympathy for his circumstances while explaining why their particular program couldn't help him. It was a bureaucratic maze designed to exhaust applicants' energy and resolve, where each dead end came with suggestions to try other agencies that would inevitably provide their own reasons for being unable to assist. "What are our options?" Thomas asked, though he could already read the answer in the uncomfortable glances being exchanged around the table. Dr. Walsh, who'd been treating Emily throughout her stay, spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd had this conversation before. "Emily's medically stable and ready for discharge, but she needs a clean, warm environment for her recovery to continue. Exposure to the elements could cause her pneumonia to return, potentially in a more severe form." The unspoken message was clear. Taking Emily back to the streets could kill her, but the systems designed to prevent such outcomes had no immediate solutions to offer. "There is temporary emergency custody available through the state," Patricia continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Emily could be placed in a foster home while you work on securing stable housing. It would be short-term, just until you get back on your feet." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. Foster care. The separation he'd been dreading since their first night on the streets. The ultimate failure of his ability to protect his daughter from the consequences of circumstances beyond his control. He'd heard stories from other homeless parents about children who disappeared into the system and emerged months or years later as strangers, damaged by the very programs meant to help them. "For how long?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The goal would be reunification as soon as possible," Patricia replied, with the practiced optimism of someone who specialized in making terrible options sound reasonable. Once you have stable housing and employment, we could begin the process of returning Emily to your care. Thomas understood the translation. Once he solved the problems that had taken months to develop and that required resources he didn't possess, he might be allowed to reclaim his role as Emily's father. The timeline could be weeks, months, or years, depending on variables that remained largely outside his control. There has to be another option, Thomas said, desperation creeping into his voice despite his efforts to remain calm. Somewhere we can stay together while I look for work. The social workers exchanged glances, consulting their files and computer screens, as if new resources might materialize through sufficient documentation review. But Thomas could see in their expressions that they'd already exhausted their available options, that his situation fell into the gap between programs designed to help different categories of people in crisis. "Mr. Martinez," said Janet Morrison, the hospital's administrative coordinator, "I want you to understand that everyone in this room wants what's best for Emily. We're not trying to separate your family, but we have legal obligations to ensure her safety and welfare." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, hot and dangerous. These people who'd never missed a meal, never slept in a doorway, never held their sick child while having no money for medicine, were deciding what was best for his daughter based on policies written by other people who'd never faced such circumstances. "I've never hurt Emily," Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I've never neglected her. I've protected her and loved her and done everything I could to keep her safe. The only thing I can't do is afford a house." "We understand that," Patricia replied quickly. "This isn't about your parenting or your love for Emily. It's about creating the conditions where she can be healthy and safe while you rebuild your resources." But Thomas knew that once Emily was in the system, the burden of proof would shift. Instead of being presumed fit unless proven otherwise, he'd have to demonstrate his worthiness to a series of caseworkers and judges who would evaluate his parenting through the lens of middle-class expectations about what adequate care looked like. His love for Emily, his commitment to her welfare, his willingness to sacrifice everything for her protection, none of these things would matter as much as his ability to provide material stability that his current circumstances made impossible. "I need some time to think," Thomas said, standing abruptly from the conference table. "Can I see Emily?" "Of course," Dr. Walsh replied. "But we'll need a decision by tomorrow morning. Emily's ready for discharge, and we can't keep her here indefinitely." Thomas walked through the hospital corridors feeling like a condemned man heading toward execution. The cheerful decorations on the pediatric ward, cartoon characters and bright colors designed to make sick children feel less frightened, now seemed to mock his situation. Children everywhere were surrounded by families who could provide for them, who didn't have to choose between keeping their kids and keeping them safe. Emily was sitting up in bed, coloring in a book that one of the nurses had given her. She looked up when Thomas entered, offering him the radiant smile that had sustained him through their darkest moments. "Daddy," she said, holding up her artwork, "look, I made you a picture." The drawing showed two stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun, standing in front of a house with smoke curling from its chimney. "That's us," Emily explained, "in our new home." Thomas felt his heart break completely. How could he explain to his 7-year-old daughter that the system designed to protect children might require separating them? How could he make her understand that adults who claimed to care about her welfare were preparing to take her away from the only parent she had left? "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Thomas said, accepting the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. "Tell me about the house." "It has a warm fireplace," Emily said, pointing to the chimney she'd drawn, "and a big bed where we can both sleep safely, and maybe a little garden where we can grow flowers like Mommy used to." Thomas sat on the edge of her bed, struggling to maintain his composure. "Emily, I need to tell you something important. The people here, they want to help us, but they think it might be better if you stayed somewhere else for a while." Emily's crayon froze mid-stroke across the coloring book page, her small hand trembling as the meaning of her father's words sank in. The bright yellow sun she'd been coloring seemed to dim before Thomas's eyes, and he watched his daughter's face transform from innocent joy to the kind of premature understanding that children in crisis are forced to develop. "You mean we won't be together?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper, her green eyes filling with tears that she tried desperately to hold back. Thomas reached for her, pulling her small body against his chest as his own tears finally broke free. "I don't want that to happen, sweetheart. I'm trying to find another way. but the doctors and social workers think you need a warm house to get completely better, and I don't have one to give you right now." Emily clung to him with desperate strength, her small fists gripping his worn shirt, as if she could somehow anchor them together through sheer determination. "I don't want a warm house if you're not there," she sobbed. "I want to stay with you, Daddy. Please don't let them take me away." The sound of his daughter's breaking heart shattered something fundamental inside Thomas. In that moment, surrounded by the cheerful pediatric ward decorations that now felt like elaborate mockery, he made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and resolve. "Listen to me, Emily," he said, gently lifting her chin so she could see his face. "I promise you that we will not be separated. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to find a way. Do you trust me?" Emily nodded through her tears, though Thomas could see the doubt flickering in her eyes, the learned wariness of a child who'd already lost too much to have complete faith in adult promises. But she wanted to believe him, and that desperate hope would have to be enough to sustain them both through whatever came next. That evening, after Emily had fallen asleep clutching her drawing of their imaginary home, Thomas sat in the hospital chair and methodically called every number in his phone, reaching out to distant relatives, old co-workers, former neighbors, anyone who might offer even temporary shelter for a father and daughter facing separation. But 8 months of homelessness had already exhausted his network of contacts, and most calls went to voicemail boxes that were never returned. His brother Miguel in Milwaukee listened to Thomas's explanation with uncomfortable silence, before finally admitting that his girlfriend had issued an ultimatum. If Thomas and Emily showed up again, she would move out. Former colleagues from Midwest Manufacturing expressed sympathy, but explained that they were struggling with their own financial challenges in an economy that had eliminated manufacturing jobs throughout the region. By midnight, Thomas had exhausted every possibility he could think of. The social workers had been clear. Emily would be discharged tomorrow morning, and if he couldn't provide adequate housing, the state would intervene in her best interests. Thomas understood that once that process began, reclaiming custody could take months or years, assuming he could ever satisfy the bureaucratic requirements for proving his fitness as a parent. Sleep was impossible. Thomas spent the night walking the hospital corridors, past sleeping patients and overworked staff, trying to think of options he hadn't yet considered. The chapel on the second floor offered quiet refuge, and he found himself sitting in a pew, despite his complicated relationship with Faith since Sarah's death. "I don't know if anyone's listening," Thomas whispered to the empty room, "but if you are, Emily doesn't deserve this. Whatever I've done wrong, whatever mistakes I've made, she's innocent. Please don't let the system destroy what's left of our family." Dawn brought no miraculous inspiration, only the arrival of Patricia Reeves with discharge paperwork and the same gentle but implacable expression she'd worn during yesterday's meeting. "Good morning, Mr. Martinez. Have you had a chance to consider the options we discussed?" Thomas looked at Emily, who was pretending to be asleep but was clearly listening to every word. "I need more time," he said desperately. "Just a few more days to find something." "I understand your reluctance," Patricia replied, "but keeping Emily here longer isn't medically justified, and it's not fair to other families who need these beds. We have a good foster family lined up. The Hendersons have experience with temporary placements, and they live only 20 minutes away. You could visit regularly while you work on your housing situation." The reasonableness of her tone made Thomas want to scream. These people were dismantling his family with bureaucratic efficiency while speaking in gentle voices about Emily's best interests. They couldn't understand that for a child who'd already lost her mother and her home, losing her father, even temporarily, might damage her in ways that no amount of material comfort could repair. "Mr. Martinez," Patricia continued, consulting her clipboard, "I need you to sign these papers authorizing temporary custody transfer. The van from Children's Services will be here at 10 a.m. Thomas stared at the papers as if they were weapons pointed at his heart. Once he signed them, Emily would become a case number in the system, another displaced child whose welfare would be managed by strangers who saw her 3 times a month for scheduled visits. He thought about his wife Sarah, about the promises they'd made to each other, about protecting their daughter, about how completely he was failing to honor those commitments. Then Emily sat up in her hospital bed, her hair tousled, and her face still bearing the soft vulnerability of interrupted sleep. "Daddy," she said quietly, "are you signing the papers that send me away?" The direct question hit Thomas like a physical blow. How could he explain that signing meant losing her, but refusing to sign might mean losing her anyway, when social services obtained court orders that would accomplish the same result with additional legal complications. "I don't want to," Thomas said honestly, "but the people here think it's what's best for you." Emily considered this with the seriousness that children develop when their world has become unpredictable and dangerous. "What do you think is best for me, Daddy?" Before Thomas could answer, a commotion in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Raised voices, the sound of someone arguing with hospital security, footsteps moving quickly toward their room. Thomas tensed, wondering if the foster care van had arrived early or if some other crisis was about to complicate their already impossible situation. The door opened to reveal Diane Patterson, still wearing her bakery apron and carrying a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread. Her face was flushed from running, and her eyes held the determined expression of someone who'd made a difficult decision and intended to see it through regardless of obstacles. "I'm sorry I'm late," Diane said breathlessly, looking directly at Patricia Reeves. "I came as soon as I got the message." Patricia consulted her clipboard with obvious confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't have any record of—" "I'm the friend Mr. Martinez mentioned," Diane interrupted, setting the bag of pastries on Emily's bedside table. "The one he and Emily have been staying with. There seems to have been some miscommunication about our living arrangement." Thomas stared at Diane in shock, unable to process why she was there or what she was trying to accomplish. They'd had no contact since that night 3 weeks ago when she'd given them her key. How had she even known they were in the hospital? Emily, however, had no such confusion. "Diane!" she exclaimed, her face lighting up with genuine joy. "You brought us bread." "I brought you something better than bread," Diane said, smiling at Emily before turning back to Patricia. "I brought you a home." The words hung in the air like a promise too good to be real. Thomas felt his chest tighten with a mixture of hope and terror, afraid to believe that salvation could arrive in the form of a woman in a flour-dusted apron carrying fresh pastries. "Ms. Patricia began, pen poised over her clipboard. "Patterson. Diane Patterson. And before you ask, yes, I have adequate housing. Yes, I've been FBI background checked for my business license. Yes, I understand the responsibilities involved in providing temporary shelter for a family in crisis." Diane's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent the morning preparing for exactly this conversation. Patricia made notes, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine surprise. "And you're willing to house Mr. Martinez and Emily while he seeks permanent employment and housing?" "I'm not just willing," Diane said firmly. "I'm insisting on it. This family belongs together, and anyone who tries to separate them will have to go through me first." For the first time in months, Thomas felt something crack open in his chest that wasn't pain or fear, but the dangerous, fragile beginning of hope. The paperwork took 3 hours. 3 hours of forms, phone calls, background checks, and bureaucratic procedures that transformed Diane's spontaneous act of kindness into legally documented temporary guardianship. Patricia Reeves made call after call, verifying Diane's business license, checking her criminal background, confirming her housing situation met state requirements for emergency placement. Thomas sat in stunned silence throughout the process, afraid that speaking might somehow break the spell that had brought Diane to their rescue. He watched her answer questions with the patience of someone who understood that bureaucracy moved slowly but could be navigated by people willing to respect its procedures. She provided bank statements, business references, utility bills, all the documentation that proved she was the kind of stable adult that the system recognized as suitable for caring for children. "How did you know we were here?" Thomas finally asked during a brief lull in the paperwork process. Diane smiled, an expression that carried both sadness and determination. "Father Miguel from St. Anthony's called me yesterday. Apparently you'd contacted the church asking about emergency housing, and when he heard your name and Emily's, he remembered that I'd mentioned helping a homeless father and daughter a few weeks ago. He thought I might want to know about your situation." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. Father Miguel was the priest at the church where they'd attended Mass occasionally when they still had a home, where Sarah had volunteered in the soup kitchen before her illness. The connection seemed impossibly small and impossibly large at the same time, a reminder that even in a city of millions, human networks could still catch people when they fell. "But why?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't owe us anything. You already helped us more than anyone had a right to expect." Diane was quiet for a long moment, watching Emily color in her book while the adults handled the logistics of her future. 15 years ago, she said finally. "I was sleeping in my car behind a Denny's restaurant. I'd lost my apartment, my job, everything I'd worked for. A stranger gave me the key to a church office where I could stay safe for a week while I figured out my next step." She paused, remembering details that still felt fresh despite the years that had passed. "That person saved my life, and I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I'd do the same for someone else. When I gave you my storage room key that night, I thought I was fulfilling that promise. But then Father Miguel called and I realized that one night of shelter wasn't enough. Sometimes keeping a promise means doing more than you originally planned." Patricia returned with a final stack of forms and the expression of someone who'd successfully navigated complex regulations. "Everything checks out," she announced. "Ms. Patterson, you're approved for emergency temporary housing assistance. Mr. Martinez, this arrangement gives you 60 days to secure employment and permanent housing. During that time, Emily can remain in your custody as long as she's living in Ms. Patterson's approved residence." Thomas felt tears threatening to overwhelm him. 60 days, 2 months to rebuild a life that had taken 8 months to completely fall apart. It wasn't a solution, but it was a chance, the first real opportunity he'd had to move forward rather than simply survive from day to day. "Thank you," he said to Patricia, then turned to Diane with words that felt completely inadequate for the magnitude of what she'd done. "I don't know how to repay this." "How you can repay it by getting back on your feet," Diane replied firmly, "and by helping someone else when you're able to. That's how these things work. They move forward, one person at a time." Emily looked up from her coloring book, her eyes bright with the first genuine happiness Thomas had seen from her in weeks. "Are we really going to live with Diane? For a little while," Thomas said, afraid to promise more than the system had guaranteed them. "While Daddy finds a job and saves money for our own place." "Can I help in the bakery?" Emily asked Diane with the earnest hopefulness of a child who'd learned to find joy in small possibilities. Diane laughed, a warm sound that filled the sterile hospital room with something approaching normalcy. "I think we can arrange that. I could use an assistant who knows how to smile at customers." The discharge process that morning felt surreal after months of having nowhere to go. Thomas packed their few possessions while Emily chatted excitedly with Diane about the bakery, about her apartment, about whether they could get a library card and maybe visit the zoo when she felt completely better. The casual assumption that there would be a future to plan for, activities to enjoy, normal childhood experiences to anticipate. These simple hopes felt miraculous after so many weeks of focusing only on immediate survival. Diane's apartment was a modest 2-bedroom space above her bakery, accessible through a separate entrance on the side of the building. The rooms were small but clean and warm, furnished with the comfortable practicality of someone who valued function over fashion. The guest bedroom had a double bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser with a mirror, and a window that looked out onto the quiet street where families walked their dogs and children played in front yards. "This is yours for as long as you need it," Diane said, setting their backpacks on the bed. "There are towels in the bathroom, food in the kitchen. Make yourselves at home." Emily explored the apartment with the wonder of someone discovering an alien planet. Running water from faucets whenever you wanted it, electricity that turned on with the flip of a switch, a refrigerator humming quietly in the kitchen, full of food that didn't require careful rationing, a bathroom with a lock on the door, privacy for personal needs that had become public necessities during their time on the streets. "Daddy," Emily whispered, testing the light switch in their bedroom, "it's like magic." Thomas understood what she meant. After months of scarcity, abundance felt supernatural. The simple ability to take a hot shower, to sleep in a bed, to eat food that hadn't been donated or discarded. These basic elements of normal life had become privileges they'd forgotten they'd once taken for granted. That first night in Diane's apartment, Thomas lay awake listening to Emily's peaceful breathing beside him. She'd fallen asleep almost immediately, her small body finally relaxing completely for the first time in months. The apartment was quiet except for the gentle sounds of the neighborhood settling in for the night. Distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere, the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Thomas thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Sarah's death, the medical bills, the job loss, the foreclosure, all the disasters that had seemed like evidence that the universe was indifferent to human suffering. But then Diane's initial kindness, Father Miguel's phone call, the social worker's willingness to bend regulations to keep their family together. These interventions suggested that maybe the universe operated on more complex principles than simple cruelty or random chance. The next morning, Thomas woke to the smell of fresh bread baking downstairs and the sound of Emily giggling in the kitchen. He found them both covered in flour, working together to shape dinner rolls, while Diane explained the mysteries of yeast and rising times. "Daddy," Emily called when she saw him, "Diane's teaching me how to make bread. Look, I made this one all by myself." She held up a misshapen roll that looked more like abstract sculpture than food, her face beaming with pride at her creation. Thomas felt his heart expand with an emotion he hadn't experienced in months, not just relief or gratitude, but actual happiness. The simple joy of watching his daughter learn something new, create something with her own hands, experience the satisfaction of productive work. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Thomas said, meaning it completely. "I bet it'll taste delicious." Diane wiped flour from her hands and poured Thomas a cup of coffee, the first he'd had in months that wasn't from a gas station or charity kitchen. "I've been thinking," she said. "I could use some help with the bakery. The work's physical but not complicated. Mixing, cleaning, customer service. It doesn't pay much, but it's immediate income, while you look for something permanent." Thomas stared at her, once again stunned by her generosity. "For you've already done so much?" "I've done what anyone should do," Diane interrupted. "This is just practical business. I need help. You need work. Emily can stay here after school, help with small tasks, do her homework in the back room. It solves problems for everyone." Thomas looked around the warm kitchen at Emily happily shaping dough, at Diane offering him not just charity but dignity through honest work. For the first time in months, he could imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival, a trajectory that led towards stability rather than further decline. "When do I start?" he asked. Diane smiled. "How about right now? These dinner rolls won't bake themselves, and the afternoon customers will be here soon. Emily, do you want to show your daddy how to make the dough rise?" Emily clapped her flour-covered hands together, leaving white prints on her jeans. "Yes, Daddy. You have to be very gentle with the bread. Diane says it's alive, and if you're too rough, it gets scared and won't grow properly." Thomas rolled up his sleeves and joined them at the counter, his hands working dough for the first time in his adult life. The physical work felt good, purposeful in ways that filled something inside him that had been empty for too long. But more than that, the simple act of working alongside his daughter and the woman who'd saved them both felt like the beginning of something he'd almost forgotten how to recognize. A family, however unconventional, however temporary, however miraculous. 6 weeks had passed since Thomas and Emily had moved into Diane's apartment, and the transformation was visible in ways both large and small. Emily had gained weight, her hollow cheeks filling out, and her eyes regaining the bright curiosity that had been dimmed by months of survival mode. She attended Lincoln Elementary again, the same school she'd left when they lost their house, and her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had welcomed her back with the kind of gentle understanding that suggested she knew something about the complexities of children's lives. Thomas had thrown himself into the bakery work with the desperate energy of someone who understood that this opportunity represented more than just a job. It was his chance to prove that he could rebuild their lives from the foundation up. He arrived each morning at 4 a.m. to help with the bread production, learning the precise timing and temperature requirements that turned flour and water into sustenance. His hands, once skilled at electrical work, adapted to the rhythms of kneading and shaping, measuring and mixing. Diane had proven to be more than an employer. She'd become a mentor in the art of resilience. She taught Thomas not just the technical aspects of commercial baking, but the business skills he'd need to eventually support his family independently. She showed him how to read wholesale food prices, how to manage inventory, how to build relationships with suppliers who could make the difference between profit and loss in a business with narrow margins. "The secret," Diane explained one morning as they prepared the day's first batch of sourdough, "is understanding that every loaf tells a story. People don't just buy bread, they buy the memory of their grandmother's kitchen, the comfort of knowing someone cared enough to make something from scratch, the feeling that they're supporting their community rather than some distant corporation." Thomas absorbed these lessons with the intensity of someone who recognized that knowledge was the only insurance against returning to the streets. He kept a notebook where he recorded everything: recipes, supplier contacts, customer preferences, seasonal patterns that affected sales. Emily often helped him with his notes, her neat second-grade handwriting filling pages with observations about which pastries sold best on rainy days and which customers always asked for extra bags. The routine had become precious to all three of them. Emily would wake up and come downstairs to help with the final preparations before school, arranging display cases and filling sugar dispensers, while Thomas and Diane handled the heavy work of moving bread from ovens to cooling racks. The smell of fresh baking had become Emily's alarm clock, and she often said it was better than any breakfast cereal commercial for making her hungry. Regular customers had begun to recognize Thomas, greeting him by name and asking about Emily's progress in school. Mrs. Chen, who bought 2 baguettes every Tuesday, had offered to help Emily with her math homework. Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the auto repair shop next door, had mentioned that he might need someone with electrical skills if Thomas was ever interested in part-time work. These small acknowledgements of their belonging in the community felt like treasures to Thomas. After months of being invisible, of being seen as problems to be moved along rather than people deserving of basic courtesy, the simple experience of being known and valued by neighbors restored something in him that had been damaged by homelessness. But it was the evening conversations with Diane that had perhaps the greatest impact on Thomas's sense of possibility. After Emily went to bed, they would sit in Diane's small living room sharing tea and talking about everything from Emily's adjustment to school to Thomas's long-term goals for financial independence. Diane had a way of asking questions that helped Thomas clarify his own thoughts, that pushed him to think beyond immediate survival toward genuine planning for the future. "What did you love about your old job?" Diane asked one evening, watching Thomas review his notebook of bakery observations. Thomas considered the question carefully. "The problem-solving, I guess. When a machine broke down, I had to figure out what was wrong and how to fix it. Every situation was different, but the principles were the same. Trace the problem to its source, understand how the system was supposed to work, then restore the proper function." "That's exactly what you're doing now," Diane pointed out. "Learning how the bakery system works, identifying what needs to be improved, figuring out how to make it more efficient and profitable. The skills transfer, even when the industry doesn't." These conversations had begun to reshape Thomas's understanding of his own capabilities. For months, he'd seen himself as someone who'd failed at the basic task of providing for his family. But Diane helped him recognize that his situation had resulted from external circumstances, economic forces, medical emergencies, systemic inequalities, rather than personal inadequacies. "You didn't fail," she told him one night, when he was particularly hard on himself about their period of homelessness. "You survived. You kept Emily safe and loved and hopeful through circumstances that would have broken many people. That's not failure. That's heroism." Emily's progress had been equally remarkable. Her cough had completely disappeared, her energy had returned, and she'd begun to display the kind of childhood enthusiasm that had been suppressed during their months of crisis. She talked about friends at school, about books she wanted to read, about a class field trip to the Museum of Science and Industry that she was excited to attend. More importantly, she'd stopped asking the careful questions that had characterized her behavior during their homelessness: whether they had enough money for food, whether they were safe where they were sleeping, whether Thomas was okay when he looked worried. The constant vigilance that poverty had forced upon her had relaxed, allowing her to simply be a 7-year-old child again. But Thomas knew their arrangement with Diane was temporary, and as the 60-day deadline approached, he'd begun to feel the familiar anxiety of uncertain futures. His savings from the bakery work were growing, but still insufficient for first month's rent and security deposits on apartments in neighborhoods with decent schools. The mathematical reality of transitioning from dependence to independence seemed daunting when calculated against Chicago's rental market. Diane seemed to sense his growing tension. "Thomas," she said one evening as they closed the bakery together, "I want to talk to you about something. I've been thinking about expanding the business, maybe adding a small lunch menu, staying open later. It would require someone with management skills, someone who understands both the operational side and the customer service aspects." Thomas felt his heart rate increase. Was she offering him a permanent position? Something that might provide enough income to support Emily independently? "The job would pay enough to afford a small apartment," Diane continued, "and it would come with health insurance through the Bakers Union. Emily could still help out after school if she wanted to, but you'd have your own place, your own life." The offer felt like a lifeline thrown to someone who'd been treading water for so long that dry land had begun to seem mythical. But Thomas had learned to be careful about hope, to examine opportunities for hidden costs or unrealistic expectations. "What would you need from me?" he asked. "Honesty, reliability, And the willingness to learn whatever you don't already know, Diane replied. I'm not getting any younger, and I'd like to know that the bakery will continue to serve this community, even after I can't run it myself anymore. I'm not talking about charity, Thomas. I'm talking about partnership. The word partnership hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went beyond simple employment. Thomas understood that Diane was offering him not just a job, but a path toward genuine independence, a chance to build something lasting for Emily's future. I don't know what to say, Thomas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Say you'll think about it, Diane suggested. Talk to Emily about whether she'd like to stay in this neighborhood. Keep going to Lincoln Elementary. See how the idea feels when you've had time to process it. That night, as Thomas tucked Emily into her bed in their temporary room above the bakery, she looked up at him with the serious expression she wore when asking important questions. Daddy, are we going to have to leave Diane soon? Thomas had been dreading this conversation, but Emily's directness made evasion impossible. We might be able to stay in the neighborhood, he said carefully. Diane offered me a job that would let us get our own apartment nearby. What would you think about that? Emily's face lit up with excitement. Really? We could stay near the bakery, and I could keep going to my school, and Diane would still be our friend? Yes to all of those things, Thomas confirmed, feeling his own excitement grow as he spoke the possibilities aloud. We'd have our own place, but we'd still be part of this community. Emily sat up in bed, her arms wrapping around Thomas's neck in a fierce hug. I want that, Daddy. I want us to have a home again, but I want it to be here, where people know us and care about us. As Thomas held his daughter, feeling her solid weight and listening to her steady breathing, he realized that somewhere in the past 6 weeks, they'd already found what they'd been looking for all along, not just shelter or safety, but belonging. A place where their story was known and valued, where their struggles were understood and their successes celebrated. Then that's what we'll do, Thomas whispered against Emily's hair. We'll build our new life right here, one day at a time, like bread rising in a warm oven. Emily giggled at the comparison, settling back into her pillow with the contented sigh of a child who felt secure in her world. I love you, Daddy. I love you too, sweetheart. More than all the bread in all the bakeries in all the world. As Emily drifted off to sleep, Thomas sat beside her bed and allowed himself to imagine their future with an optimism he hadn't dared to feel in months. Tomorrow, he would accept Diane's offer. Next week, they would start looking for their own apartment. Next month, Emily would continue her education without interruption. Next year, she might not even remember the details of their time on the streets, though Thomas hoped she'd always remember the kindness that had saved them both. 2 years later, Thomas Martinez stood behind the counter of Sweet Dreams Bakery, wearing a crisp white apron with manager, embroidered in blue thread across the chest pocket. The early morning light streamed through windows that he'd personally cleaned and polished, illuminating display cases filled with pastries he'd learned to create with his own hands. The transformation was so complete that sometimes he had to remind himself that this wasn't a dream he might suddenly wake up from. Emily, now 9 years old, and radiating the confident energy of a child who'd never doubted her place in the world, sat at a small table in the corner doing her homework before school. Her backpack was new, her clothes fit properly, and her hair was pulled back in the kind of neat braids that spoke of morning routines, unhurried by crisis. She looked up from her math worksheet and waved at Mrs. Chen, who was arriving for her regular Tuesday baguettes. "Good morning, Mr. Martinez," Mrs. Chen called out, her voice carrying the warmth reserved for people who'd become genuine fixtures in the community. "How's our little assistant manager today?" Emily beamed at the title, which had been bestowed upon her by the regular customers who'd watched her grow from a thin, quiet child into a confident young person who knew everyone's usual orders and could make change for a $5 bill without hesitation. "I'm helping Daddy make the books balance," Emily announced proudly, holding up her homework. "Mrs. Rodriguez says math is everywhere, so I'm practicing with real bakery numbers." Thomas smiled as he arranged fresh croissants in the display case, remembering when Emily's biggest worry had been whether they'd have enough to eat. Now she was learning multiplication tables and planning to join the school's junior entrepreneur club, where students developed business plans for imaginary companies. The bakery had thrived under Thomas's management. His electrical background had proven invaluable when upgrading equipment and improving efficiency, while his customer service skills, honed during months of dependence on strangers' kindness, had helped build relationships that extended far beyond simple commercial transactions. He'd implemented several small innovations that had increased both productivity and profit margins, earning him a genuine partnership stake in the business that Diane had formalized through legal documents that made him co-owner. Their apartment was 3 blocks away, a modest 2-bedroom space that Emily had decorated with artwork from school and photographs of their new life. Thomas had insisted on paying market rent, despite Diane's protests, understanding that true independence required the ability to support themselves completely. Their living room featured a bookshelf filled with Emily's growing collection, a comfortable couch where they read together every evening, and framed pictures that documented their journey from desperation to stability. But the most treasured item in their apartment was a simple brass key hanging in a shadow box on the kitchen wall, accompanied by a handwritten note that read, "For one night that changed everything. D.P." It served as a daily reminder of how dramatically circumstances could shift when people chose kindness over indifference. The morning rush proceeded with the comfortable efficiency of well-practiced routine. Thomas handled the register, while Emily helped customers carry their purchases and reminded regular visitors about upcoming seasonal specials. Mr. Rodriguez stopped by for his daily coffee and Danish, mentioning that his auto shop was expanding and he could use someone with electrical skills for part-time evening work if Thomas was interested in additional income. "Maybe in a few months," Thomas replied, considering the offer seriously. "Emily's got a school play coming up, and I want to make sure I'm available for all her rehearsals." The casual assumption that he could choose to prioritize his daughter's activities over immediate financial opportunities still felt miraculous to Thomas. The security of steady employment, reliable housing, and genuine community connections had given him the luxury of thinking beyond survival toward the kind of life planning that most people took for granted. Around noon, as the lunch crowd began to arrive, Thomas noticed a familiar figure standing uncertainly outside the bakery windows. The man was thin, wearing clothes that had seen too many washes and too many nights sleeping rough. He carried a backpack that contained what appeared to be all his possessions, and his eyes held the careful wariness that Thomas recognized from his own recent experience with homelessness. Without hesitation, Thomas walked outside, remembering how it felt to stand on the other side of windows, looking in at warmth and abundance that seemed unreachable. "Can I help you with something?" Thomas asked gently, using the same tone Diane had employed when she'd first approached him and Emily on that cold December night. The man looked up, startled by the offer of assistance. "I'm sorry, I was just... the smell of the bread. It reminded me of better times. I'll move along." "No need to move along," Thomas said. "I'm Thomas Martinez. I manage this place. What's your name?" "David," the man replied hesitantly. "David Walsh. I used to work construction before the economy went bad. Been looking for work for months now, but..." He gestured vaguely at his appearance, understanding that desperation had a scent that made employers uncomfortable. Thomas recognized the shame in David's voice, the way homelessness made people feel responsible for circumstances largely beyond their control. "Are you hungry, David? We've got soup and sandwiches, coffee that's actually decent." David's eyes filled with tears at the simple offer of food without judgment or conditions. "I don't have money for..." "Didn't ask if you had money," Thomas interrupted. "Asked if you were hungry. Come on inside, get warm, have something to eat. We can talk while you're getting your strength back." Emily looked up from her homework as Thomas led David inside, her face showing curiosity rather than fear. She'd learned to read people through her father's eyes, understanding that circumstances didn't define character, and that kindness was always the appropriate first response to human need. "Daddy," Emily said quietly, as Thomas prepared a bowl of vegetable soup, "is Mr. David going to be okay?" "I think so, sweetheart," Thomas replied, remembering Diane's words about how kindness moved forward one person at a time. Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them until they can believe in themselves again. Over the next hour, as David ate and warmed up, Thomas learned his story. Military veteran, construction worker, recent divorce that had led to financial crisis and eventual homelessness. The details were different, but the pattern was heartbreakingly familiar. Good people overwhelmed by circumstances that spiraled beyond their ability to control. "Listen, David," Thomas said as the lunch rush subsided, "I can't solve all your problems, but I can offer you a start. There's a storage room upstairs where you can stay for a few nights while you get cleaned up and look for work. It's not much, but it's warm and safe." David stared at Thomas as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Thomas glanced at the key hanging in its shadow box, thinking about the chain of kindness that had brought him to this moment. Someone helped me once when I had nothing. I promised myself I'd pass that forward when I could. That evening, after Emily had gone to bed and David was settled in the small room upstairs, Thomas called Diane to tell her about their new temporary resident. She was in Florida, visiting her sister after selling her half of the bakery to Thomas at a price far below market value, claiming she was ready for retirement, but really ensuring his complete financial independence. "You did the right thing," Diane said, when Thomas finished explaining David's situation. "That's what the room is for, giving people a chance to get back on their feet." "I keep thinking about that night you found us," Thomas said. "How different everything could have been if you'd just walked past." "But I didn't walk past," Diane replied, "and now you're not walking past either. That's how it works, Thomas. Kindness isn't a finite resource. The more you give away, the more there is." 6 months later, David Walsh had found steady construction work and moved into his own apartment. He'd become a regular customer at Sweet Dreams, stopping by every morning for coffee and conversation before heading to job sites around the city. He'd also started volunteering at St. Anthony's Soup Kitchen, serving meals to people experiencing the kind of homelessness he remembered all too well. Emily had started a community helpers club at school, where students collected supplies for homeless shelters and learned about local organizations that assisted families in crisis. Her teacher said she'd never seen a 9-year-old with such mature understanding of social responsibility and such confidence in her ability to make a difference in other people's lives. Thomas kept a notebook, documenting everyone who'd stayed in the upstairs room over the past year, 12 people total, all of whom had successfully transitioned to independent housing and employment. Some sent holiday cards, others stopped by occasionally to share updates about their progress. All of them had signed the guest book Emily had created, writing messages of gratitude and hope for future visitors who might need reminding that their current circumstances were temporary. On the 2nd anniversary of that December night when Diane had first given them her key, Thomas and Emily walked past the grocery store steps, where they'd once sat shivering and desperate. The building looked the same, but everything else had changed. Emily wore a warm winter coat that fit properly, carried a backpack full of completed homework, and talked excitedly about the birthday party she was planning for her friend from school. "Daddy," Emily said as they paused at the spot where their old life had ended and their new one had begun, "do you think there are other families out there like we used to be? People who just need someone to help them?" Thomas looked at his daughter, healthy, confident, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and valued, and felt his heart expand with pride and possibility. "I'm sure there are, sweetheart. What do you think we should do about that?" Emily considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I think we should keep helping. Not just sometimes, but always, because that's what people who love each other do. They help." Thomas squeezed her hand, understanding that the lessons she'd learned about kindness and community would shape her entire life in ways that privilege never could have taught her. "That's exactly what we'll do," he promised, always. As they walked home through the neighborhood that had embraced them, past the bakery that had given them purpose, toward the apartment that represented their independence, Thomas thought about the miracle of ordinary kindness. How a single key shared on a cold night had unlocked not just a door but an entire future. How one person's willingness to see humanity in desperate circumstances had created ripples of compassion that continued to spread through their community. Have you ever experienced or witnessed this kind of life-changing kindness? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps spread these important messages of hope and human connection. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.